everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Barry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's Jackie.
How's everyone doing at our next recording session? And by next, this recording session.
I'm already at the next one, and it's going really great here in the future.
I'm already at the beach.
What about the past recording session? How's that go?
Those were great.
That was actually
remember
great,
those
too.
fondly.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
I remember laughing, and that was really nice.
Good times. Good times.
Well, this isn't a podcast about future time travel podcasts. This is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic in the field and discuss relevant research articles all about it. And this week, we're doing a listener request. How do we know it's a listener request? Because we sure didn't want to talk about it on our own, but because we care about our listeners, we're going to do it. We're doing stimulus equivalence, which, you know, when's the first time you met stimulus equivalent? No, we're not going to do that and walk down memory lane. I will, however, admit that for me, stimulus equivalence is a lot like sort of like the equivalent of a car. You know, I understand some basic things about a car. And if you ask me, like, how does a car go? I can describe, there's an engine and it takes gas. And I know a few little tricks about it. But if you try to make me do much more than that, I'd rather just take it for granted that it exists and it's great. And someone else can tell me about it if I ever get stuck. So that's my relationship with stimulus equivalence. I'll every now and again try to get deep into it and think about, maximizing how I write all my programs to really take advantage of emergent relationships. And I'll write a couple of them and I'll show them to people and they'll say, this seems complicated. I don't understand what you're talking about. And I'll say, well, I'll explain it to you. And then I realize I don't want to explain it to anyone.
They've already left.
And they've already walked away from me. And I'm not sure if I could even explain it if I needed to. So that's my relationship. How about you guys?
We learned about stimulus equivalence in a class that I feel like was basically dedicated to stimulus equivalence.
Yep, we read the entire white book.
Uh-huh.
And I can't remember what that class was called, but it might have just been called stimulus equivalence
It might have been. I don't remember either. And by the white book, we're not referencing Cooper. It was a book, a paperback book. Mine was. And it just had the big equivalence triangle on the front. And it was written by Sidman a long time ago.
1971.
Mm-hmm.
I'd see that book lying around the offices, back in the day. And I could tell people must be in a grad program or we're trying to show off. You're like, whoops, like my copy of Stimulus Equivalence just happens to be here on the desk, And even then I was like, whoa, that book looks scary because it reminds me of geometry, which was the one math in school where I actually had a math teacher tell my mother, I don't think your son understands any math. She was very upset about that.
No, so the thing I loved about this book, I'm going back to the book because you didn't let me finish.
Oh, so sorry.
Is that it's called Equivalence Relations in Behavior. The two little dots are those colons. A research story.
Oh, that's right.
By Murray Sidman. And he wrote it as if it was like an adventure into his life on how he came up with the idea of stimulus equivalence. But unlike Skinner's meanderings, he actually sprinkled research inside of the book. And so you'd come across and he's like, and then here's the research study that I wrote. And then it would just be copy and pasted into the book pages.
Oh, see,
that's how you do it.
Yeah.
See, I like how Skinner writes because I think that's how I do most things in life, which is I've read a thing about this or I did this thing. Am I going to cite it for you? Of course not. Just take it from me. I know what I'm talking about. That's sort of how I like to do things. Citations?
Me.
No, thank you. Just trust me. Trust me. I know what I'm talking about.
On Amazon, you can buy it. And it's clearly, Sidman is uncomfortable without data. He has spent his life gathering new data, thinking about it, and working out the next steps. Here is his story. So whoever wrote that, they're like, oh, man.
So when all the quarantines and shutdowns are done, we're going to see the stimulus equivalence movie?
Yeah, it's going to happen.
Oh, boy.
One customer rating at 5 stars.
5 stars.
I probably should revisit it now that I have a little more of a different background than I did then. It was a good book. It was a good place to start learning about stimulus equivalence. You just really jumped right in with that book.
So we're all fans of stimulus equivalence. We are all at varying levels of comfort in talking about stimulus equivalence. But hey, that's one of the reasons there's 3 of us on the show, because there's always somebody who knows more than the others, which is great. But let's talk about what articles we'll be discussing today, and then we'll get into the discussion. And the first of those articles, we're going in the Wayback Machine to Dr. Murray Sidman's article himself. No, Dr. Murray Sidman himself's article.
Don't do that.
It's not a grammar podcast, folks. Acquisition of Matching to Sample via Mediated Transfer by Sidman, Cresson Jr., and Willson-Morris from the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, 1974. And then we'll also be talking about using conditional discrimination training to produce emergent relations between coins and their values in children with autism by Kainz, Miguel, Cow, and Finn from the Journal of Behavior Analysis, 2011. And using stimulus equivalence procedures to teach name-face matching to adults with brain injuries by Cowley, Green, and Braunling-McMorrow from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 1992. Good old 90s. The go-go 90s.
I love the 90s. I frequently listen to the 90s on a radio station. Jam out.
I mean, we love the 90s specifically
the name of the
because
radio
that's
station?
when we would have listened to radio.
That's right.
I wish it were.
Radio, everyone. It's a thing.
I guess.
My kids are always like, skip this song. I don't like this song. Go back. Like, I can't. It's radio. That's not how it works.
All right. Why don't we get started with a basic discussion of what stimulus equivalence is as a nice refresher to bring all the audience into the world of stimulus equivalence.
Sure. So in the world, there are lots and lots and lots of different stimuli.
That do not look the same.
They don't look the same.
Nope.
Exactly. But
What if they're twins?
I don't even know how to respond to that.
Oh no, I've derailed the entire podcast. I'm sorry, folks.
Shutting the mics off.
But through the process of learning, one may come to respond to some stimuli in the same way that one would respond to other stimuli, and thereby having them function together as
Right.
a class.
And when you talk about the stimuli here, they're called arbitrary stimuli. And they create arbitrary relations because they topographically do not have any point-to-point correspondence or similarities. So that's when you read it, when they say arbitrary, that's what they mean, is that they don't look like each other. So without training, you wouldn't sort these things together as meaning the same thing.
Great. Because like a red light and a stop sign are not arbitrary because they're both red,
Right.
right? But to pull off your study, Rob, the number 10 and a dime are arbitrary.
Right.
They don't have any topographical similarities, so they are part of an arbitrary stimulus class. But when we talk about 10 cents and we talk about the word dime and we talk about the picture of a dime, we can respond to all of those in the same way because they, in effect, function as a stimulus class, right? So when that happens, we say that all of those stimuli are equivalent within this stimulus class.
Right. There you go. We're done. We've done it.
We did it. Now, I do
There's
want to
more
give
to it than that.
That's true.
And I do want to give a disclaimer here is in this episode, we are just going to talk about stimulus equivalence. We are not going to venture over into RFT or relational frame theory.
Oh my God, I just felt like that nightmare where it's like, oh no, I haven't been to any of my classes and it's time for the exam. I did not prep for that.
Right. So we are not trained in RFT, at least I'm not trained in RFT, and that would be a whole different discussion that is beyond the scope of the current podcast.
I actually took 2 classes.
Yeah.
in it, so-
Oh, good. I saw Mark Sundberg talk about it and I was able to keep up okay, but it was, a little outside my comfort zone.
Yeah. So one thing that I would recommend for people that are interested in the differences between RFT and stimulus equivalence is to listen to the Behavioral Observations podcast, shouting it out to Matt Chicoria, where he had Dr. David Palmer and Dr. Josh Pritchard on the show to have a heaty discussion about the differences.
Gentlemanly, though, I'm
it was
sure.
very gentlemanly, actually. I was actually quite impressed with both of them. Way to go for, this can be a heated debate in our field, and they kept it light and airy, but yet very serious. It's
Both
almost
airy and meaty.
yeah, it was like the best sandwich ever. You're right. Like the vegetables were airy, the meat was meaty, the bread was fresh. It was
Probably
on
a little bit
point.
saucy.
Yeah, tiny bit saucy. And so I would encourage people to listen to that episode on that discussion between RFT and stimulus equivalence.
Cool.
But that's not this. This is not that.
Did we say what RFT is? Or we just
Yeah,
said
I did.
RFT
Relational
a
frame
bunch?
theory.
Okay.
Yeah, we did.
Okay, I wasn't.
If we're talking about stimulus equivalence, that came first.
That's right.
Yep.
It's not a chicken and egg thing.
Nope. One came first. Look at-
Legitimately came
And
first.
that's why I'm going to take it way back to 1974 in my article. And I chose a Sidman article for that reason as well. But before we get into that, we do want to break down some of the different relations that are part of the stimulus equivalence triangle. So like we referenced before, there on the cover of this book, there is this funny little diagram. It looks like a triangle. I was going to try to say which type of triangle.
An equilateral triangle?
It's not an equalateral.
An isosceles triangle?
It's the one where the
a right triangle.
Obtuse.
Is obtuse the one where it's not isosceles, but it goes the other way?
An obtuse triangle would be a triangle with a degree greater than 90 degrees.
It's that kind.
It is the obtuse triangle.
Okay, thank you. Jackie's our fact checker for the evening.
But I also already knew that. I was the one that told you before I checked it. So just saying.
I was getting there, but I wasn't sure if that was right. Because
So-
then I was like, well, then why is one not called an acute triangle?
So
why is it
Diana-
called isosceles? Isosceles means the two sides are of equal length.
Yes. So what you're saying is that stimulus equivalence only occurs if one of the relations has an angle greater than 90 degrees.
Correct.
You're
that is
confusing
correct,
me
Rob.
here.
No,
Let's-
okay. So I'm just trying to
mixing
describe
our
what the
metaphors.
triangle looks like. Okay, on the front cover of this thing, there is
Very
an
important you know the
obtuse
angles.
shaped triangle. You have to be able to picture it.
When I say cat and I have a picture of cat, they must be presented at a certain angle or it won't count.
You stop. So there's an A little point on the triangle, there's a B little point on the triangle, and there's a C little point on the triangle. And I'm doing this from memory. So I believe that there are some arrows connecting A to B and B to C.
You're just
and C
describing
to
a
A.
stimulus equivalence
So-
triangle.
I sure am.
Okay.
So, but there's two different types of lines. The first line is a...
A solid
Solid.
line.
There you go. That's the word. I knew obtuse, but did know solid. Solid line, and the solid line represents teaching,
Yep.
training. So those are the
trained
things that you
responses, or the trained
trained,
relations.
right? And then the next line is the dotted line, and that usually
the dashed.
or the dashed line. It goes back. It usually is in conjunction with the solid line. I almost forgot that word again. For the most part, in some of the relations, and that means that those are emergent relations. So those are ones
It'll
we
be-
didn't teach.
Right. And the arrow will be going one way on the solid line and the other way on the dashed or dotted line
Right.
as well.
There'll be only one relation where you'll see two dashed lines, and that's the equivalence relation.
Very nice.
Yeah.
All right.
So again, I think we're spending a lot of time on the triangle, but for those listeners who are, either new BCBAs or you are, finishing up your program, I feel like the stimulus equivalence triangle is sort of the behavior analytic equivalent of using your fingers to do math problems. It's like, I gotta figure out these relations. I'll draw a picture real quick, and here's my, vocal stimulus, and here's my picture of a stimulus, and here's where they go in my little triangle.
I do think it's helpful to draw it out
is a
sometimes
helpful
because
visual.
it can get kind of confusing. What you're trying to do here through the process of stimulus equivalence is teach some relations, right? So like in my previous example, I said the word dime, right? And let's say I taught you to point to a piece of paper that had the numbers 10 cents on it. So I taught you to do that out of an array. And every time I say dime, you point to the number 10, right? And then after that, I held up the picture of the number 10 and I had you point to the dime, the face side of a dime out of an array, right? And then after that, I checked to see, now if I say dime, do you point to the face side of the dime? Did you catch all that? Right? Point being, you can teach some of these equivalences, right? Like 10 cents is the same as me saying the word dime. And you can only teach some of those parts and then check to see if you get other parts for free. If you have multiple things that are going to function as equivalence relations, you may not actually need to train all three of those stimuli to indicate that they equal one another. You can actually get a little bit of it for free if you train it in the right way.
I want to take stimulus equivalence training and I want to write like a general education book using that technology, but I want to like change the wording so it sounds really nice. I want to call it immaculate teaching. I feel like I would make $1 million.
That's really funny. Okay, so we're going to take Diana's triangle and talk about what things are called in the triangle.
And this is where this becomes way too much like geometry and I get panic sweats. So take it slow. Take it slow for some of us who don't
All
have a
right.
great relationship with triangles.
So the first thing you do is you hang out at each point alone.
Mm-hmm.
And you take the stimuli that is at each point alone and make sure that the participant can match the stimuli or stimulus to itself, right? So if I have a picture of a tree out of an array of two other pictures that are not trees, and I give someone a picture of the tree as a sample, can they then put the picture with the tree with the picture of the tree?
Yeah.
Right? So that would be called reflexivity. A equals A is what they call it. B equals B. C equals C. And the A, B, and C, just when they talk about it in stimulus equivalence, they're talking about the different stimuli, right? So the three different arbitrary stimuli that are then going to become one.
Right.
Going to become one. Yeah.
I always remember that as if you were standing in front of a mirror then it's your reflection, right? Back at you, and it's identical. So that's what you're looking to do here is identical matching occurring. So reflexivity is like your reflection.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I remember that one.
All right.
Okay?
So that's our A to A.
That's
on
our
our
A to
triangle.
A.
Most of the time you don't have to teach that, but sometimes you do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time you don't.
But sometimes you do.
But most of the time
Right.
you don't.
But occasionally you do.
That's true.
Okay.
Except for most of the time.
Right, but only sometimes.
Okay, anyway.
So after that, then you are going to establish your first leg of your equivalence training, right? So you're going to teach that whatever is A. So Jackie, it was a tree. Is that right?
It was a tree.
Okay. So whatever.
A picture of a tree.
A picture of a tree. And we're going to teach that that is the same as something else. How about the written word tree?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to have cat, tree, and cup. Let's say, for example, that's a bad example because cat and cup both start with C. So don't do that. Cat, tree, and dog instead. Written out on words. And you're going to show a picture of a tree and teach that the matching response is the written word tree. So that's our B. Our B is written word in our example here.
And you're teaching the A
We're going
to
to teach
B relation.
A to B. Exactly. So we're going to teach that. And then we're going to check to see if once we've taught A to B, we also have B to A.
Right. So when you say A to B, B to A, you're talking about switching the comparison and samples up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because sometimes that gets a little confusing. And they're like, what? So whatever you were holding up to match and whatever was down as the comparison will then come up to be the sample. Yeah.
So now we have a picture of a, what did I say? Cat, tree, and dog.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have pictures of those down. We hold up the word, printed word, tree, and does the person match that to the picture of a tree? That was already taught.
If you have to teach that, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Right now, we're not in the big deal phase.
Yeah.
No, it's all a learning process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just like other types of training that we do for other sets of stimuli. But the idea of stimulus equivalence is that we're going to teach these particular sets of relations in a particular order and thus get some additional relations for free.
Mm-hmm.
So the process of teaching A to B and then checking for B to C, if we see that, or even if we have to teach it, like you're saying, Jackie, once we've confirmed, then that is called symmetry. A to B equals B to A.
Yes.
Yep. And then once you've done that, you've taught A to B, then you teach B to C. You can go back and see then, does C to B equal B to C?
Mm-hmm.
And B to A equal A to B? And you can't have transitivity if you have to teach something.
That's
Assessment.
directly from mathematical
Yep, that's
terminology.
Yep, that's the direct assessment.
Mhm.
So, right, you teach A to B, you teach B to C, and then you assess A to C and C to A. That's called transitivity. And if there's an emergent relation there without teaching, then you can say you have equivalence. If you have to teach it, you have to teach it, unfortunately, right? But that's not equivalence because then it was trained.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, if you're doing the elevator pitch, it's what if I could teach two relations and from that, a third one magically appeared without anything?
Actually, not even a third one. Three.
No, sorry, yes.
3 relations, right? If you teach 2, you might get 1, 2, 3, 4 relations.
Yes. What if I got 4 relations? You're
You
right.
teach A to
I always
B.
think of it as a one-way street,
Yeah.
but it's a back and forth set of arrows.
You can teach A to B and B to C, then you could get B to A, C to B, A to C, and C to A.
That's a lot.
Right.
And
And
that-
it's the A to C and C to A,
Right.
the transitivity component, that once those are present, then you can say you have equivalence.
That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's even cooler when you add a 4th order. When
Oh,
you
yeah.
have a D stimulus and an E stimulus, it gets mad. Anyway.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's like a magic machine that when it works, many, many relations are learned without needing to, lift an additional finger just because you taught a few. You have a base of your house and then it grows from there magically overnight. Like elves.
Yeah, sure, Rob. That's right.
I'm trying to go as far magical and fake as possible.
No, I
for
know.
some
I get
reason.
it. I get it. But it doesn't require any magic is the actual magical part. It's just teaching. It's just teaching carefully, right? So teaching in a particular way so that you
Yes.
can get the most bang for your buck, so to say. So I went back to the beginning and looked at a lot of very old articles related to stimulus equivalence. And I selected this one that I selected.
Because it was so old and dusty.
Yeah, so the other ones I picked up just crumbled apart in my hands. So this one was intact, so that's why I went with it. No, I just, I thought it was a good one to kind of start us off, and I'll go through it. We went through a lot of the basics just now, so now I'm just going to start saying so many letters in a row, you won't even know. No, I'm not. I'm going to try to take it slow. These early articles, many of them, most of them were done by Murray Sidman and his crew. This one in particular was from 1974. It was published in JAB rather than in JABA. And he was very interested in the idea of stimulus equivalence, and he actually referenced way back in 1935, there were other researchers who were looking at this same topic, and they were calling it mediated transfer. So they were saying we could teach these two unrelated things and have them start to function as though they are connected, and they're kind of sort of connected by this third other thing, right? The third thing being the thing that we taught.
One thing I was curious about in this article, Diana, and I honestly don't believe it was discussed, but so I don't know if either of you just heard it, is that idea of mediated transfer one that stimulus equivalence is more just the advancement of that idea, or are they separate ideas, like subtly different from each other?
You know, I think really what Sidman's trying to do here is take terms that were preceded behaviorism, really, and kind of bring them over and do some additional study so that they could figure out what was going on.
So, how does this term work?
Yeah.
Bring it up to date.
Right. And this was pretty much in direct continuance of that earlier research. And I put in the Peters quote because it's like so applicable to the research that we're going to look at today, which is, quote, thus the connection AB is the result of two other connections, AC and BC, right? So it's like basically exactly what we're talking about here. So Sidman had some earlier work that he had done. There's a 71 study that he referenced here. And in that study, they did this picture to word matching, kind of like the tree example we were just talking about. But in doing so, they went through the process of teaching matching the picture to the auditory word. And then they taught the written word to the auditory word in between. Okay. They had done that, and they had sort of introduced this auditory word as the idea of this mediating stimulus in between. And they said, well, we did that, but we kind of exposed them to this like auditory word in the middle. And it's also possible that they had heard auditory words before. So they had kind of like an internal confound thing going on there, that they were worried about that influencing the emergent relation. So in this study, they wanted to fix that earlier concern and try to go about establishing the equivalence relation without one of those potential mediating variables. The current study was to determine if this type of mediated transfer would occur without the response mediator, which is what they were calling hearing the spoken word. So there was not that component present here. Sidman described this process as proceeding around the receptive triangle in another direction. So instead of going the way that they had been going, he said, let's try it the other way around and see if we see the same result without teaching things in the order that they had been taught previously. So here they were going to teach B to A rather than A to B. So they were going to teach the named word sample to the picture comparison, and that was called auditory comprehension. They're going to teach C to B, which was the visual picture sample, to a printed name comparison, which was what they were calling reading comprehension. And then they were going to test for C to A, the named word sample to the printed word comparison, which was auditory receptive reading. And then as a bonus, this was only a bonus, they were going to test C to D. So now we flipped over. We have two symmetric obtuse triangles next to one another. And the D point is over here on the other side, which was oral naming. So they never exposed them to the names. They just wanted to see, kind of like as a null hypothesis, almost like we shouldn't actually see this, right? Because we didn't ever teach it. We're going to see if the oral names were spoken by the participant when they were presented with the visual. So that was the plan here. There were two participants in this study, both of whom were teenagers and had Down syndrome. JC was one initials and PA was the other one's initials, and they had not ever, or they were their pseudonym initials, they had not ever received reading instruction before. So this should have been relatively new territory for them. And they each had their own set of stimuli that were appropriate for them. So for JC, they were looking to teach equivalence relations between a picture, a written word, and a named word. So, and there was a list of 20 words, which I can tell you what they are if you want to know.
Don't want to know.
Bed, bee, box, boy, bug, car, cat, cow, dog, ear, hat, hen, hut, hoe, man, pie, pig, saw, and zoo. I did want to tell you them just because I want you to be able to picture them
Okay.
later. Okay. And then for PA, his were letters. They were going to teach the uppercase letter to the lowercase letter to the named letter. And those letters are less exciting, but they were A, B, E, G, L, and N, which all looked quite different from one another, which I think is important to note. And then they were going to teach them in what these days would be seen as an unnecessary apparatus, because now you just be like, well, why didn't they just use a computer? Why didn't they just use PowerPoint to teach this? But they didn't have that then, right?
Nope.
So this
You'd
was
have to get a punch card and a computer the size of a small football stadium to do that on a computer, like in modern times. So not feasible.
that was not feasible. So they made this bespoke apparatus in order to do this type of teaching. And it was backlit. They could slide in different cards in the front.
It's like an overhead projector.
Kind of like an overhead projector.
That's kind of how I was imagining
right?
it.
And there was a center circle that was going to be, I always say this wrong. That's the comparison stimuli.
The comparison stimuli are on the bottom. The sample
that's okay.
The sample stimuli is the one you're holding.
I never get that right. So
That's why I'm here.
Thank you. The picture that was going to be in the center was the sample stimulus. And then around it were 8 other they were all circles. So 8 other smaller circles. And in those smaller circles were going to be the comparison stimuli. So they had different, like I said, different slides that went in. And for each of the things that they were going to teach, they actually had multiple exemplars as well, which is kind of good to note. What would happen is they would put the slide in and the participant would need to touch the middle of the slide first, so that they had a differential observing response component there. And then once that happened, then the other ones would appear. So it's not just an overhead projector, Rob. There's other, somehow, there's like lights and stuff inside.
I know. It was shockingly complex, old kind of analog technology for an experiment that I think we do without really thinking about the setup these days.
I actually saw it.
You did?
Yep.
Where?
In the Shriver Center.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was in the Shriver Center, and it was amazing, actually. It looked like the Oregon Trail 80s edition, right? And
Is it really big?
huge.
I thought so.
Yeah, it's huge. But yeah, it was really fascinating to see. And then it was nice to see all the iterations after it, right? Until they had the big, huge computer screen, and they still had that same like circle setup. But then you were like popping stars and balloons that were fading around the screen. So that was always fascinating. But then you see the screen, and then you go behind the screen, and it's like wire. It's like crazy.
Well, cathode ray tubes shooting at you.
It's like just so fascinating to see.
That's so cool. But I described it okay?
Yeah, you did great.
Okay. All right, cool.
They painted a real word picture, that Murray Sidman.
Yes, and he has the equivalence triangle in here as well as a diagram in the article. And it's got both sides of the triangle and all the arrows going all different ways. So it looks cool and complicated. And then they had a little bit of a difference in the way that they taught this whole process for each of the participants, just based on the number of stimuli that were there and also how they sort of responded to the training. So for JC, they initially did a pretest, which was just a baseline to see if he knew any of these relations yet. Then they did pre-teaching, which was the identity matching, make sure that was solid. Then they taught B to A, which was matching pictures to the named words, and then they tested everything again. And then they taught C to B, which is matching the printed words to the pictures. And because he had those 20 stimuli, they didn't do them all at once. There's too many. So they started with 9, and then they gradually worked up through the remaining stimuli that weren't present all the way up to 20. They tested everything again. And then when they did this equivalence battery, like I said, they sort of rotated through several sets of the pictures so that the picture was not always exactly the same. So they're really thinking, I think, about how this was going to function in real life, right? Because they wanted it to be functional for him. So, for example, I loved this. The different models of car were used in the pictures, and the example they gave was like, sometimes the car was a VW and sometimes it was an MG. I just like that because you don't see either of those cars now. My dad had an MG for a while. It was like very fun.
That's fancy.
Yeah. It didn't really run, but it's fun to play in the back. And that's what they did for him. And then for PA, they did the pre-testing, and then they did his teaching a little bit different. So for him, they alternated the visual auditory match, which was the B to A, and the visual match, which was the uppercase and lowercase letter for each letter. They taught one and then the other back and forth for each letter, and then they moved on to the next letter. And then they just tested for equivalence for everything. And then they did find for him that they needed to teach the visual to visual B to C, so the reverse of the symmetry for C to B with those upper and lowercase letters, and they tested again. So they got what they were looking for. They got the basic equivalence triangle, right? But they did not get that other side of the triangle, the oral naming, to the same degree. They got it a little bit, but that was not something that was taught. So we're not expecting to get it, so it was kind of okay that they didn't really get it. And Sidman rounded this out by saying the mediation was independent of oral naming. So that with that initial concern that they had where, oh no, we taught this like auditory naming in the middle of this as like the hinge in the equivalence triangle, let's say, and maybe that was really a necessary component. They were able through this to say, no, that wasn't a necessary component. We're able to do this without that piece. So that was good.
And this came hotly within the time where they were talking about naming as like something that was intrinsic, right?
Right. Yeah.
In your mind file.
Yeah. So all of that is kind of, that's why it's so fascinating too when you read the 70s articles, right? Because it's around like the controversy of like, can you match things without naming them? And yes, you can.
Yeah. The only other thing I'm going to note here before I turn it over to you guys is that there were a lot of trials. They painstakingly told us at the end of each condition how many trials were involved. And I didn't do the precise math. I did a little bit of an estimation, but JC needed maybe about 1,200 trials to establish this equivalence relation. But keep in mind, it was also 20 different equivalence relations. And then for PA, it was the 6 upper and lowercase letters. He needed about 8,000 trials. So that was not a short process. The other thing, I guess, the flip side of that would be, yeah, that this was long, but we got some relations for free. So if we hadn't taught it in this way, it would have been even more potential trials. Yeah. So they were able to successfully teach stimulus equivalence, or see equivalence emerge, I should say, through the process of teaching some legs of the triangle. And that was in 1974.
Why don't we just take it through history? Because one of the nice things about when we think about stimulus equivalence is sort of, all right, well, that's the basics of stimulus equivalence. And I think we always kind of go to our, dog, tree, cat descriptions of it. But how does that technology then turn into meaningful teaching down the road? So the other two articles we're going to talk about are application related to face and name matching, I guess. That's what it ends up being. And then also more of an academic or educational usage of stimulus equivalence technology. Jackie, why don't you go next with the name face matching?
Yeah, so I found this pretty interesting as an article, and I actually make a lot of students read this article because it's going beyond the field of developmental disabilities, and it's looking at those with brain injuries. And so one common issue for those that have brain injuries is that they suffer from short and long-term memory and may have difficulty remembering people's names to their faces. And I actually didn't know that when I read this. And so I was like, oh, I knew that they had short and long-term memory, but I didn't know about the name to face issue. But I guess it's a pretty common issue.
Prosopagnosia? This would not be an example of that, though, would it?
They're just saying they can't match a name to a face. So
like prosopagnosia recognize faces, I
don't know. I think so, yeah.
You are right, Rob.
Why, thank you. I recognize those words.
You can recognize the face, but they can't recognize the face and then say the name. Right? And so previous research has used rehearsal strategies, visual imagery, and verbal mediation to try to teach these stimulus associations, right? The face is a stimulus. The name is a stimulus.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always work. So here, these authors wanted to see if stimulus equivalence methods could help with teaching these arbitrary stimulus relations among faces and names to individuals with brain injuries. So cool. Good application. I love that they were thinking. They had their thinking caps on. So there's 3 adult men who had experienced a brain injury, 1 in the form of a stroke and 2 in the form of car accidents. And they happened between 2 and 11 years ago. So they weren't like very recent. All of them experienced memory deficits, both short and long-term memory deficits. And all 3 men were referred by staff because they could not match the name of a staff member or a therapist to their face, even after years of frequent interactions. So some things that were mildly helpful is that each of the participants had a written schedule, and they would have the written name of the therapist on the schedule, But most of the time, even if the written name was there, they could say the written name, but didn't quite know if it was the therapist or not. Right? So those are the things that they had tried before, unsuccessfully. So the stimuli that were included in this study were the dictated names. So this is a little bit different, right? Because the experimenter is going to say the name, right? So this can only be a sample stimulus.
Yeah.
Can't be a comparison stimulus.
Right.
Okay? Just want to pull that out there because that always gets confusing.
You guys get very confusing.
How would I do that?
Well, some people have done it in the past. So some of my students have done it where you make an audio recording and you have to press the button, but it gets a little more tricky, right?
Yeah,
they didn't do that in this study.
Okay.
It's the dictated name is the stimulus A, and it is just a sample, not a comparison. The faces are photographs of therapists' faces from the shoulders up. So just a good headshot.
Nice.
They went to glamour shots at the mall.
I hope there was a rose.
1992. They should have had like a fancy laser background.
Laser background with a rose.
Pop collar.
Really,
So-
the Vaseline lens, really, really make them look good.
Right, so the headshot faces were sample or stimuli B. And then the written names, it's important to note too that the written names were the names of the therapist written in the participant's handwriting, right? Because that is what they're going to see on their schedule because they write their own schedule. So I love that they were really paying attention to applied details in here. And then for one participant Bob, they also looked at whether they could form equivalence relations to the nameplates on the door in the rehab facility of the therapist.
Cool.
So that's just for Bob. I like that for Bob only. So
And Jackie, they were able to navigate around the residents with their schedule. It was just the issue with the naming.
So you are stealing my spoiler.
I'm sorry.
Get back. We're not there yet.
I just always think it's so fascinating when we talk about brain injury and the idea of so many relationships we just take for granted. Like, oh, you see my face, you know my name. Therefore, you would just know all the relations, right? And so, well, actually, there's no guarantee that one would have all those relations,
right?
Solidly in there, especially with a brain injury.
But you stole my thunder, so we're not there yet.
I'm sorry.
Everyone erase that in their memory.
You know what, actually, we just edit that out.
No, I like this part. I want everyone to hear this part. We're back. Okay. So they used a pretest, train, post-test sequence. So that was one of the limitations of the study, actually, because you can't actually demonstrate a strong functional relationship with a pretest, post-test design. But they admitted it, and so that's great, right? And in these situations, it's really difficult to use another design. And they do an excellent, excellent job describing why they can't use another design. So for all of you that don't, are not going to read this article, but you should, they discuss how if there's too many baseline sessions in one, then it might create an error history that might then falsely put arbitrary relations that aren't arbitrary relations together, and it just is a mess, basically. They're like, it can be a mess. There's a huge error history. We don't want that because we're teaching. So they're like, you just have to deal with this. And they're like, given the years and years of giving people's false names, we're pretty sure this is what happened. Yeah. I like that they say that.
Do you think that was preemptively included in this article, or was it a reviewer 2 response?
It might have been a reviewer 2 response, actually. I think in one spot, the one spot under the experimental plan seems like a reviewer 2 response. In the limitations, it seems like they added that in the limitations, but they were just highlighting it in the experimental plan.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It's one of those small, splitting hairs that when you're talking about editing research makes a lot of sense. But when you're sort of I just want to read this for information, like, yeah, of course, your explanation makes perfect sense to me. Why would I care? Why would I complain about that? So that's why you guys are the smart folks, all you editing. I'm just like, sounds good to me.
Yeah, so I just like that they brought that in. They were like,
yeah.
So just so you know, look here,
this
guys.
Works.
Yeah, this works.
Did they just write that back to the reviewer, like, shrug picture? Come on.
They're right. We were careful not to expose participant to a lot of pre-testing sessions to avoid a history with stimuli. I just like I like when people say that. So they did have some significant pre-tests, but how they did it is they made them varied so that you didn't have just sitting at the table doing match to sample the whole time. So they did an oral naming pre-test where they showed a picture of a person and said, who's this? They also did it with written names. What does this say? And then with the nameplate. What does this say? Right? So that was one pretest. The second pretest was sorting. They took all of the stimuli that could be sorted, right? the name, the written name, the nameplate, and the picture, and said, put all of these together.
I like that.
Yeah, me too. It was pretty applied.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like, yay. And then, of course, what they had to do is then assess the samples, right, in a match to sample test. They looked at generalized identitying to the written word, to the nameplate, and to the faces. The reflexivity, right? Name, face to face, whatever. So they did that. They did all of those things. So the settings occurred in an office where the experimenter sat opposite. They were very specific about that as well. Opposite of one another. And I made sure when I read it that it didn't appear that one of the therapists was the experimenter. Right? That would get really confusing.
Yeah.
Right? It didn't seem like that. It seemed like the experimenter was the experimenter. And so they did the pretest out of 10 total therapists and found the 3 that didn't have any type of relation formed. Mm-hmm. So occasionally multiple sessions were run during a day. For Bob, they said they separate him by 15 minutes, but sessions were 30 to 50 minutes in length, which is kind of long. 50 minutes seems like a long time.
You're
right?
trying to get a lot of practice in like a short chunk of time.
That is true because the experiment only lasted a maximum of 13 weeks. And the 13 weeks was because one of the participants left and then came back and had to basically restart. So, but yeah, so there you go. There's the general procedures, like where we're at. We're hanging out in the office. They did do the tabletop match to sample for most of the sessions, right? So that's generally how stimulus equivalence is taught, where you have, just like you said, a sample and a comparison. And they had, the samples were either visuals or words, and the comparison were all visuals. Makes sense. For the pretest trials, there was 24 to 36 trials per session. And then for training, there was usually 30 trials per session, to put it all out there. So it's kind of a lot, but not like a ton, right? If you think every trial is a minute.
Yeah.
Imagine. Yeah. So pretests were delivered once. If they rocked it, they were never delivered again and removed. If they didn't rock it, right, they didn't establish the mastery criteria, then they were delivered the pretest once more. If they didn't get it, they moved into training. And then we talked about the sorting. We talked about the match to samples. Oh, but what was interesting, I guess, for this one is that they weren't surprised that everyone had generalized identity matching, right? So that means that they could match face-to-face, written name to written name, nameplate to nameplate.
Yeah.
They could also read the words,
names.
Right? The names, and so match those together. So they only taught the relation AB to everyone, right? The name, the face to the name, which is so easy. That's all they taught to everyone. And they assessed,
easy in the sense there was only one relation.
Right.
But it may have been hard for them to learn.
Yes.
Well, it must have been hard for them to learn.
It was
they
very,
had not naturally learned that skill.
Yes. But for here, all the other relations were taught. Had already been taught, right?
Yeah, they only had to teach the one, and then they got
teach
the
one.
But again, they're very much in line with the participant makeup in that they had a brain injury. So they probably had all of these skills intact at one point.
Yes. Yep. And then what I find fascinating, which Rob ruined for me.
I just wanted to sound smart. I'm so sorry.
You'll sound smart soon. Is my most favorite
Not now, but
part. Yeah, this is my time to sound smart. My favorite part of the whole study, which I almost cried. I might be feeling a little sensitive, but I love when studies take things to the next level. And this is a next level study right here where they have an application test. Right? So what they're required to do, the participants, is see the handwritten name that they wrote for themselves and go find the therapist, the real actual therapist in the rehab facility. And then when they find them, they say, who's that? And they have to say their name. So the oral naming part, we're seeing if it's emerged. Right? So that one, they had not directly assessed or taught. So I love that. Unfortunately, only one person followed through with it. But you know what? For that one person, spoiler alert, it worked. When I read that, I was like, oh, Cowley, you've got me. You've got me at this application test. So that was really awesome.
Yeah, because just because you now know the picture to the name doesn't mean you know the person
Right.
to the name.
And so they're
It would be a lot
assessing
to
it.
have them stand there as comparison stimuli through all of those trials.
Right, 36 trials for 50 minutes.
Right. So this,
You'd have 3 different people, and they have to keep like switching which position
Right.
they're in.
They said they were unsystematically switching, so they could have just done it, but that would have been really kind of awkward.
Yeah.
they were probably needed elsewhere.
Yeah. Their job wasn't to stand there for 50 minutes a day. Yeah. So the one thing that they did know in the training, it was like a general match to sample training where if they got it right, they said, good job. If they got it wrong, they said, try again. And they made them keep trying it again until they got it right. You wouldn't necessarily do that with a kid, right? Like,
Right.
But that's how they used their error correction procedure. For one of the participants, they figured out his training was really, really long. And they figured that praise wasn't an effective reinforcer for him. They tried to add a card game in. It was too long. So then they just gave him money for ice cream, and that shaped up the behavior real fast. So you knew it was a reinforcer issue and not like a learning issue,
Right.
which I liked. And I did note that one participant left and then came back,
Right.
so had to do some maintenance trials, do some retraining. But yeah, surprisingly, all of the participants demonstrated oral naming when presented with the written names and with the faces. That was just fun that came out of it. And all of them reliably demonstrated equivalence, right? So they could match the picture to the name to the picture, right? And could name the person. Bob was the one that was training on the nameplates. Nameplates didn't emerge for some reason. Really wasn't part of the stimulus equivalence class.
That's interesting.
It was interesting. They really didn't have an answer for it.
I mean, it could have been a couple,
Many
need more
things,
practice
right?
opportunities.
Yeah.
They just weren't the same
Yeah.
class.
Maybe it was the person's whole name, so it was a lot more letters than just writing his first name down.
Yeah.
Right. Only Ed sorted 81% accurately, but no one else did in the beginning, but then everyone sorted accurately at the end. And training occurred, which is kind of a long time, 37 training sets. Remember, that's
Yes.
a lot, to 72, which is
quite a lot.
significant. Ed was the only one that rocked it across all post tests, including oral naming, finding, and sorting. So they did all those tests again. Sam needed a little more training. He needed a booster training, but then they couldn't do the application test for him because 2 of his therapists had left the facility.
Oh no.
So, and Bob left before he could do sorting and oral naming. So, I guess that happens.
Yes. Probably good that
Right. Yeah. But,
We are hoping.
right.
They don't describe why.
But I just really love that this application to a broader population, right? That this would be a really useful skill for someone to have. And it seems a little bit long, but once you have it, you have it. And you only had to teach one relation.
And then
Which
I
is
think
also
when we're
helpful.
talking about long, we're also talking about, 37 to 72 sessions. That is really long in isolation. But when you talk about these men as having this deficit or having this difficulty for years and years and years, 32 to 37 to 72, that's a drop in the bucket of,
Right. 13 weeks isn't that long.
Yeah,
and that
it's
was
not
the
that bad.
longest, right?
Right, because every
7
day
to
they
13
couldn't
weeks.
do their schedule.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what was happening is it would say, and they also could have put their person's picture on the schedule. Right. But
what have they been doing all this? They're like, you know what? We should probably do something about this after some period of time.
right. But that was what was going on is they would look at their schedule and it would say, I don't know.
Go see Janet.
Right. Janet. But they didn't know who Janet was. So then someone would have to come help them.
Right.
And then they
might have found Janet, but they didn't know.
That's true.
They weren't able to name it was Janet.
That's true. Yeah. So, and then you just feel like helpless and like you can't do anything by yourself. And that's not a good feeling either.
Right.
So we don't have any social validity data
Nope.
here, but I would also like to know that piece. Like, did it make them feel more empowered to be able to follow that schedule themselves?
Would they use this again? Because we would assume that the participants have this trouble in any environment that they're in. So is this something that they'd like to do again? Would this be something they'd like to learn with people in their, outside of the therapy setting?
I'd also like to know if they did this with, new therapists or new people, would the learning time be shorter?
All right.
Yeah. So I just love the application test. And I think that I would encourage anyone that's going to be doing stimulus equivalence work to add that real life piece in, right? Because if it doesn't work in real life, then it's not helpful if it can work in the office.
Even if it makes you cry.
Right.
Well, I realize one thing that we have not done, even though we've gone so long, which is take a little break. So why don't we do that? And we'll come back with our last article for the episode. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking all about stimulus equivalence. But before we get into our final article for the episode, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. Ooh, ah. You need to finish listening to the show. You also then need to go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. That's /GET-CEUS. And you'll need to enter some information, including 2 secret code words we've hidden in the episode. I'll give you the first of those right now. It is Taco Cat. TACOCAT. Taco Cat. What's a taco cat? I guess a cat in a taco. It's also a card in the very popular Exploding Kittens card game, Taco Cat. And now let's move into our final article, which takes the theme of stimulus equivalence and generalizing this technology into the school setting. So this article that I'll be talking about is Kintz et al. 2011, which is a utilization of stimulus equivalence methodology to teach emergent relations of money. And not just money, but also with students with autism, which this is one of the earlier studies that I think was looking specifically at that population of learners. I really like this article. I give this a lot to supervisees when we're sort of talking about stimulus equivalence in the task list, because especially for, my setting is a public school. And if you don't want to know every single itty bitty detail of stimulus equivalence in its history, you should at least understand how it can be used to sort of maximize time for learners in an educational setting. And it really does work, sometimes, not always, but it often can kind of work that magic that we kind of keep joking about in terms of you don't need to teach every relation that ever existed under the sun for every stimulus you will need in a school day. Although I guess looking back in 2011, this is all about matching coins and money prices. Who does that anymore? You can't even get coins nowadays. So this is a bit old fashioned, even just being back in 2011. But it's more the idea, and then sort of taking this teaching procedure and thinking about how could you use something like this for something more relevant nowadays than coin ID or coin naming.
You still need to know how to make change.
Do you need to know how to make change anymore, Donna? Last I checked.
Not right now. We are in a coin shortage.
Coins. Where'd the coins go? I don't know. Apparently they're using them in stimulus equivalence research, and you can't have any to buy your penny whistles, your penny whistles, and your baseball cards, and your 10 cents for your cup of coffee. Sorry, Donna. Live in the now. We don't use coins anymore. So what did we do here at Kintz et al.? And like I said, this is an article on using pretty straightforward sort of match to sample procedures to teach those emergent relations with coins. This is sort of referred to some older research. There was a McDonough study in 1984 that looked at teaching a participant with a developmental disability to do some kind of coin combo matches given a printed price. And then you'd see that the emergence of a coin and a coin combo, relationships would sort of come out. There was a study by Stoddard in 1989 that they reference where they used matching and an exclusion procedure to teach 3 individuals, again, with developmental disabilities, to teach coin combinations in the presence of printed prices. So that was a lot about kind of counting coins or naming the price of a set of coins. This one's a little bit more straightforward and just sort of simple, straightforward, like, what's this? It's a coin. What coin? How much is this coin worth value? So we had 2 6-year-old boys with autism as the participants. They all had pretty good verbal behavior. They didn't get any VB-MAP scores, but they were all able to speak in multiple word sentences, or one of them was able to speak in multiple word sentence. The other one about 2 to 4 word sentence with some additional prompting. So they did have some, verbal behavior. They, worked on programs like this in their classrooms. They had 3 coins that were going to be used throughout the study: a dime, a nickel, and a penny. For those of you who haven't seen coins in a while, the penny's the brown one, the dime is the really tiny silver one, the nickel is the slightly bigger silver one, but not too big. That would be a quarter.
The nickel's a tricky one.
The nickel's that's where they get you.
Mm-hmm.
They put them all on a stimulus board. It's, again, very, very straightforward, overall procedure in terms of what this looks like. And everyone's like flashing back to like when I was working with students back when I first started in the field. Students with autism, my stimulus board, and I had my Velcro, and I put my coins on there, and then I handed up my, coin prices and everything. We had students with doing a preference assessment ahead of time, so you always had their most preferred item at the moment available following the completion of their work. They're in tokens for completing the work. And we really just sort of started with kind of a similar formats in terms of there was a pre-test, then they trained the relevant relations, and then they did a post-test. They started with the kind of, their initial first emergent relations pre-test. They did some conditional discrimination training. And then what emerged? Anything? Nothing? Hopefully something was the goal, right? And really, we're just looking at, did the student point or select the correct stimulus, or did they make the correct vocal response given the stimulus? The emergent relations could either take the form of like a visual-visual match or an auditory-visual match task. They also looked at like tacting tasks. They looked at textual tasks and interverbal. That is interverbal tasks. What is it kind of question. So that's kind of the basics. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, even though none of these individual sort of legs of the procedure are probably going to sound too difficult. One of the reasons I like this study is because it is so simple to follow through where all the relations fit in together to make your stimulus equivalence triangle. And again, one of the reasons I often give it to supervisees is because it's very clear. And so if all you wanted to do was sort of take the like general procedure here and just sort of map on new stimuli with the different skill, you could very easily do that with this article. So for the visual match to sample, again, you've got your stimulus that's a sample. And then you'd have the participant point to it to start, so the orientation response. And then the experimenter would present 3 comparison stimuli. And they'd either be like, if I give you I hold up the printed price, you select the coin that would match that price. You had an audio-visual match to sample component, which again, the experimenter will say whatever the sample is. The participant will repeat it. Again, the kind of the orienting response. And then the experimenter will present 3 comparisons. So that would be something like, so I'd say the coin name, student would select the printed price. Or I'd say some price, the student would select the actual corresponding coin. They did an interverbal test, which again, what coin is worth 10 cents, 5 cents, 1 cent? Or how much is nickel worth? How much is penny worth? How much is dime worth? And then they also had their tact or textual text, which again, I hold up a coin, I hold up a price, 10 cents, whatever it is. And what is it? It's not quite a pure tact, but you get the idea out there, right? So that would be you show the coin, the kid says it. Show the price, kid says it, the value. They did like a 3-to-1 acquisition with maintenance ratio so that they could earn tokens and, any of the baseline and all the kind of the standard stuff. Nothing too exciting here. And then when they saw like 8 out of 9 responses accurate and independent, bam, you've got your emergent relation mastery. So that was the goal. That's what they're looking for. So in terms of which of those did they actually train versus which of those then became emergent, let's go over those real quick. So for training, they taught the participants to select a coin in the presence of the dictated name. So the experimenter would go, dime, and then probably not in that voice, but they'd say something like that. And then the student would pick the dime.
I like that. Dime!
I actually know, we might all know actually all of the authors on that. I don't believe any of them had that voice.
No.
I'm thinking back in the Wayback Machine. They all had very, very wonderful voices. If any of them happen to be listening or hear them mention their article. We loved you all. They also taught the student to select a printed price given an actual coin. So like, here's the coin. And then they pick from the array of 3. They taught the student to select a printed price in the presence of a dictated price. So again, 10 cents. The student would pick up something that said 0.10. So that, that was the 10 cents that they used. They taught each of these relations to mastery in these kind of 9 trial sessions. So they'd present each of the different samples, dime, nickel, or penny 3 times. You know how it goes. One's in the left, in the middle, and the right.
Cents.
I don't think they added the song in there. It
5.
Wasn't mentioned.
Dime is worth 10 cents. Quarter 25.
So Diana, are you proposing the follow-up where you do your stimulus equivalence versus I sing a song before I do the task and we see which one goes faster?
Might be interesting.
It might be. For independent responses, the student would get praised in a token. If they were incorrect, they'd sort of present the trial again with a 0-second delay. And then once the student had learned all 3 of the coins individually, whatever relation they were training, they'd start doing mixed trials, which again is important because very rarely do you just have like, I only have pennies or I only have dimes. You have to be able to mix the coins up. when you could get coins. Again, as we said, this is an irrelevant task now because coins have vanished from the earth. They've been raptured.
They're at my house.
Do you have them in a giant Coke bottle next to your fireplace, like a 3-foot tall Coke bottle?
I do.
Oh,
yep,
Thought you would. Thought you would.
Two Coke bottles.
I saved coins in Arizona iced tea bottles all throughout college, and my very first year, I was able to buy myself one coffee a week with the coins from that I'd saved up. It was very exciting because I didn't make a lot of money my first year out of college, that's for sure. So what are the results? We have our two students. Again, we had Paul and Dennis. So Paul was kind of a chance for any of the relations that were going to be tested, that were tested in the pretest. Dennis had all of them a little bit lower than chance, except he was able to identify coins given a spoken name with 100%, which is one of those fun things I'm sure they were not expecting, but hey, people learn all sorts of different ways, right?
Absolutely.
Paul mastered the 3 training relations after about 50 trials each. So it was like 45 to 63, depending on which kind of relation or stimulus it was. Dennis took about 70 on the 2 that he had not already mastered. So that's a bit of time. But again, we're doing like 9 trials each. It wasn't like they were doing the 50-minute chunks of time. These were short trials. When they looked at the emergent relationships themselves, Paul was able to do 2 of the emergent relations during the pretest and was sort of at chance for the rest. However, once he had done his conditional discrimination training, he was able to demonstrate mastery performance for 7 untrained relations. So taught a few, taught 2, able to learn all the rest of those 7, which is pretty great. I think dictated coin names, save price were a little bit below. And again, I think it's kind of a pattern you see in this article that some of the spoken responses were a little bit lower than some of just the match to sample type responses. Dennis was able to do 1 relation prior to training. He was able to demonstrate 4 emergent relations after the conditional discrimination training had occurred. Again, he had some trouble actually reading the printed price and again, naming the coins and then saying the price after hearing the name of the coin. So again, some of the spoken responses were a little bit harder for Dennis as well. So I know in terms of, summarizing the results, so this is another good article because it spells out, here are the relations. There's a great table that spells out exactly which ones were trained and when and which ones were emergent. I didn't get into that level of detail. I sort of just went over which ones were trained and which ones existed, by the end of the study. But also because the results were very, very good. They're sort of what you would love to see in every stimulus equivalence research, which is we taught like 1 or 2 things and bam, we learned 7 or 8. All of a sudden, they magically appear. That's what you're hoping for in every case. And it doesn't always go that way. But especially for Dennis, they sort of summarized his results as being pretty much in line with what you'll see in a lot of similar research on the emergent relations with sort of the match to sample or conditional discrimination tasks, where one of the challenges became that his listener behavior was much better than his ability to then respond to novel intraverbals. So again, the sort of the speaking component of it was more challenging. Paul didn't quite have that. He actually did slight variation, but he'd done really well. So he actually was more the exception to what you typically see in this research. For any relations that weren't taught, so Dennis did have a few that did not emerge. He was just taught those individually using conditional discrimination procedures. And it took, anywhere from 63 to 153 trials. So again, a lot of trials when you just look at those numbers. So like if someone just showed me, it took us this 153 trials to learn these 2 relations, I'd say that's ridiculous. What a waste of time. But the important part is, but he had learned so many more. He learned 4 of them in 0 trial. Well, not exactly 0, but you get the idea. Without any training, he had learned all of those 4. So a lot faster. Can you imagine 153 trials for every single one of those relations? So if you train your relations between your coins, there's dictated names and the printed prices and your printed prices and your dictated coin names, you can see, or you will hopefully also get similar results, I should say. We're 2 participants, at least. You did get a lot of novel conditional relations emerging spontaneously. But bam, magic. It's not magic, but again, I feel like I'm going to...
I love everyone's going to write in, Dear Rob, stimulus equivalence is not magic.
I'm more worried that people will start talking about it like it is magic, and then I'll feel super guilty that I put that idea in I incepted that in anyone's head. They'll get yelled at by their professors or they get yelled at by their coworkers. And they're like, well, Rob said it over and over. And I don't know, that guy's on a podcast, so I just kind of earwormed its way in. I'm so sorry, everyone, preemptively.
Wish.
What, that everyone... Not that they thought it was magic. So he's going to write some sort of book of like the cult of stimulus equivalence and like blame me for the magicness of it? I hope not. So again, this is a short study, so the authors don't get into some of the other information, which you probably want to know, which is, okay, well, does this work for every student with autism? Does this work in all cases? What are the prerequisite skills? And some amount of speaker and listener skills are sort of assumed to be important for some of these relations to emerge spontaneously, but there's not like a number, oh, if you score this on a VB map, you're going to get 8 spontaneously. But if you score this on it, that doesn't exist. And I don't think it ever would. It's going to be somewhat idiosyncratic. But there is that assumption that the more verbal behavior in your repertoire, in the participant's repertoire, most likely you will see more emergent relations. But I think that's probably more a reflection of, well, clearly this individual probably has more complex verbal behavior because they've demonstrated some amount of spontaneous learning in the past, versus how much of it is because of this repertoire being taught originally. And I don't know. That's actually, I didn't even think of that question when I was writing my notes, but now I'm thinking of it is which came first. Is it you have strong verbal behavior because you are something about your learning style or the way, something about the stimuli or your environment that just makes emergent relations, quote unquote, easier to come about? Or is it the fact that you have that verbal repertoire that leads to simpler emergence of those relations? The idea of, if I just taught you like rotely to get to score high on a VB map, would then stimulus equivalence procedures work really well for you? Or is it just the fact that you were able to develop your verbal behavior without as much training? Stimulus equivalence just tends to be more effective for you, or those procedures tend to be more effective for you.
It's discriminated responding, right?
Yeah.
So if you are discriminating more things in your environment and you have that learning history, then some of this work may have already been more familiar to you.
No, but but that's the thing. I'm wondering, is it just like the sheer amount of verbal operants, or is it the fact that you were able to learn those verbal operants without as much training? That is the more important factor.
But naming has nothing to do with it, because naming is a completely separate entity when you're talking about arbitrary relations. So that is another relation that you have to learn, but it's still just a discriminated operant. So knowing the name of something isn't going to help you increase the relations, because they're still arbitrary stimulus relations.
No, but it wouldn't just be one relation. It would be the fact that you have learned a number of relations.
But you can just name it. Like, naming doesn't really do anything, right? It doesn't, I can say like phone, this, right?
Man,
but
woman, person.
Right? That's one relation, but it doesn't bring you to anything else. So naming is just one part of it. It's not bidirectional, which is why naming isn't usually included in the stimulus equivalence paradigm, right? In the little thing, because it's just an outsert that you would get if you have derived stimulus relations. That naming would come along for the ride, not that naming would then facilitate. There's actually a ton of research that naming comes out of stimulus equivalence, not the other way around. But Horn and Lowe would also argue opposite, that you need naming for everything. But
I wouldn't
either. But you don't see a ton of that research, because with naming, it's just one relation. It's not bidirectional, and it doesn't spread out the effects across different stimuli.
And so, that's a discussion of stimulus equivalence in the educational viewpoint. I think more so than the other article. Well, actually, the original Sidman did have some educational ones, but money.
Yeah,
money and all.
I think these types of educational equivalences are often the examples that we use, like money or spoken word to printed word to picture, and the same with numeric equivalences as well.
All right, well, let's go into the dissemination station, shall we? So I guess when we were talking about stimulus equivalence, it really is one of those kind of research lines that you can get very, very deep into, or you could sort of just stay on the surface and just appreciate it and then think about the research that's been done and sort of think about, well, how could I take some of these ideas and use them to maximize the efficiency of my teaching procedures? There's a lot of ways you can go at it. I know that's typically where I would look at, because that's usually more what I'm, trying to do in my own work. But for the two of you, you have to be able to, talk about it, because you never know what's going to be most important for your students to do, after they graduate. Which doesn't summarize anything. I'm just sort of making a general statement.
Yeah, I was like,
where's the question? There's been a lot of research done in stimulus equivalence. So to me, it's not a question. Sometimes I feel like we get to this point where we're like, but there's so many more questions that we want to ask. I don't have that many questions specifically, but I think that it's inventive ways in which you can use stimulus equivalence that are interesting to me, right? So what else could you teach via this method that would allow you to save the time of the person that needs to learn whatever the thing is. And we totally would have included it today. Rob, I think it was one of your grab bag articles from a while back. The piano playing one. That was one of Caio Miguel's studies, which was just such a cool idea and a cool application of stimulus equivalence in a way that one might never have thought of. So I feel like, to me, it's a matter of thinking, like, how else could this be useful for someone who does need to learn a lot of things? I have to think, I don't know exactly what I would want to use it for. What about states and their capitals and their locations?
What are some like foreign languages?
Yeah, foreign languages, they've done a ton of that. Reading comprehension, there's a ton on that. What I want to see is outside of other applications, right? So maybe look at stimulus equivalents with the geriatric population. Maybe look, can it help dementia patients?
Yeah.
So we see that it's effective, with these 3 participants with brain injury patients. Can we use it as part of a rehabilitation for, I don't know, all sorts of things. So I want to see it in any facet of teaching across all populations. That's what I want.
Yeah.
I do like the idea of utilizing it more in programs for individuals who with various memory loss or skill loss, like with the brain injury patient. That would be a very interesting way to kind of maximize what time one has. And then, of course, the capitalist in me wants to say, how could we turn this into a computerized program for blank? And then you sell it. And then, man, those words, like using the power of stimulus equivalence, or as I like to call it, immaculate education. Copyright me.
Whenever I start a new class with my students, I always tell them, like, now I need you at least for the next few weeks to sit in the seat that you're currently in, because I am establishing right now an equivalence relation between your face, your first name, your last name, and the seat that you're in. And if you move, it will screw me up.
That's why that's not a great relationship to learn.
Well, no, once I learned the seat that they're in is apparently for me a really important spatial component that allows me to better establish those relations between the other stimuli. And then once I have it, then they can move around. I just need them to be there for...
Have you drawn that triangle out? I'm curious to see it now.
It's a 4-way.
Yeah,
no, I have not. You can do research on me.
Okay.
No,
that's enough stimulus equivalence talk for me. I think that brings us to the end of the episode. We hope you enjoyed our trip down stimulus equivalence lane, and we hope that you enjoy listening to ABA Inside Track. We want to put out a couple end of show plugs. Certainly, we want to say a big thank you to all of you for listening to the show. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. There are a lot of other ways that you can connect with the show as well. You certainly can go to our social media pages. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to get CEs, as well as to find links to all of the articles discussed in this episode. And we have a new way. You can reach out to us on Patreon at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for subscribing for $5 a month, you can access additional meetups with the ABA Inside Track crew every other month, where we sort of do a BCBA topic swap, I suppose we could call it. And as well as for $10 a month listeners, we'll be doing our long-term book club podcast 3 times a year, some additional ones for additional CEs. There's also discounts and stickers and some other fun extra stuff that you can get. So check us out, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. We want to say the last code word before we go as well. You thought I forgot. Well, it's a good thing I didn't. And it is race car, RACECAR. It's a car that races. It goes fast, like a race car should. Or like that movie Cars. Those are race cars in Cars.
I've seen it.
Lightning McQueen. But the code word's race car.
Ka-chow.
Ka-chow. If that were the code word, that'd be hard to spell. But it's race car. Nice and easy. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for editing work, and to Hollis Irvin of the Sycamore Workshop for his visual design work. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye!
Bye!